Welcome to Beyond the Case. Before we dive into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a compelling story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do here. We upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly journeys into the unknown. Now, let's get into today's stories, where every single step of the investigation just raises more questions than it answers. Story 1. The Mystery of the Monaveine. On the morning of August 12, 1970, a young man named Lawrence Hallahan drove along a coastal road in County Cork, Ireland. Out the car window to his right, he could see an area called Towhead Bay, a shoreline with incredibly beautiful rock formations that led straight out to the Atlantic Ocean. People came from all over Ireland to see Towhead Bay, but for Lawrence, the incredible view was just part of his daily commute, so he really wasn't paying much attention to it. However, as he was driving along, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something unusual floating in the water. He looked closer and realized it was a sailboat. This was incredibly odd, not because boats don't go on the water, but because Towhead Bay was a notoriously dangerous area filled with jagged, hidden rocks. Nobody sailed there. As Lawrence kept driving, glancing out at the sailboat, he suddenly remembered a story that had been all over the news recently. It was about a 66-year-old retired naval officer named Edward Neal, who had gone missing at sea a few months prior. Edward had set off in his personal sailboat named the Monaveine on what should have been a simple 36-hour straight shot from England to the Isle of Man. But Edward never arrived. His family reported him missing, and the Coast Guard had been searching for the boat ever since without finding a single trace. The disappearance was a massive mystery for 2 major reasons. There hadn't been any serious storms in the area that could have damaged the boat or blown him off course. Even if there had been an emergency, Edward was an expert mariner capable of handling almost anything at sea. Yet, he never made a single distress call. Not once. But now, right in front of Lawrence, a boat was floating in Towhead Bay, hundreds of miles away from Edward's planned route. Looking closely, Lawrence saw the name painted right on the side of the hull, Monaveine. Lawrence's heart began to race. He couldn't believe he had just stumbled upon the missing vessel. He parked his car, hopped out, and scrambled down the slippery rocks to the water's edge. The boat was floating just 3 or 4 yards out. Without even taking his shoes off, Lawrence dove into the water, swam out, and pulled himself onto the deck. Looking around, there was no obvious damage to the boat, but there were also no signs of recent activity. Lawrence began shouting, "Is anybody here? Anybody on board?" But there was no response. Assuming Edward had abandoned the vessel, Lawrence began exploring the deck, driven by curiosity to solve this national mystery. He made his way to the helm, and right beside the steering wheel, he saw a 2-way marine radio. He reached over and pressed the power button. To his shock, the radio turned on perfectly. Lawrence felt a wave of unease. If the radio worked, why hadn't Edward called for help? He then approached the enclosed cabin in the center of the deck, which housed the kitchen, bathroom, and sleeping quarters. Nervously, he pushed the door open and stepped into the kitchen. It was spotlessly clean, organized, and incredibly well-stocked. There were over a dozen packages of biscuits, plenty of fresh water, tea, cocoa, and powdered milk. Lawrence was completely baffled. Why would anyone abandon a perfectly intact boat with a working radio and tons of food? However, when Lawrence walked from the kitchen into the bedroom area, he realized Edward hadn't abandoned the boat at all. There, lying in the bed, was Edward. He was dead. When authorities recovered the body, the mystery only became more bizarre. Even though Edward had been missing for 3 months, the autopsy determined he had only been dead for about 1 month. Furthermore, Edward was so profoundly emaciated that he practically looked like a skeleton, weighing just 62 pounds. The official cause of death was starvation. To this day, no one has ever been able to explain where Edward was during those first 2 months when he was still alive and the Coast Guard was actively searching for him. Why didn't he use his working radio to call for help? And how did a veteran mariner starve to death just a few feet away from a kitchen packed with food and water? Story 2. The Reverse Footprints in the Snow. On the morning of November 10th, 1982, a 54-year-old woman named Mary Kemp was sitting in her living room in Salisbury, Maryland, when the phone rang. She answered it and instantly recognized the voice of her 35-year-old son, Don. Mary smiled, asking him where he was and how he was doing. For the past month, Don had been on a cross-country road trip writing a book about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was traveling in his SUV to visit various historical Civil War landmarks. Don made it a point to check in with his mother once a week, and this morning he sounded incredibly happy. He told her he was currently in Wyoming and planned to visit an Old West museum in a few days. He promised to call her back soon. 6 days later, on the morning of November 16th, a highway patrolman was driving through a remote, snow-covered area of Carbon County, Wyoming, roughly 2,000 miles away from Mary's home in Maryland. As the patrolman approached an exit ramp, he saw something entirely out of place. An SUV was sitting dead in the middle of the road, its engine idling. All 4 doors were wide open. Clothes were scattered across the snow outside the vehicle, and it bore a Maryland license plate. Sensing something was terribly wrong, the officer approached the vehicle, but found it completely empty. However, on the passenger side, he noticed a clear set of footprints leading away from the car and directly out into the freezing wilderness. An hour later, a team of sheriff's deputies was trudging through the snow, tracking the footprints to find the missing driver, while a search plane circled overhead. The terrain was flat and bare, meaning it should have been easy to spot someone walking around. Yet they saw no one. After tracking the prints for a staggering 6 miles, the deputies looked up and saw that the trail led straight to a large red barn in the distance. The footprints walked right up to the closed barn door, with no prints leading out. The deputies assumed the driver was hiding inside. But when the lead deputy pushed the door open and stepped inside, the barn was entirely empty. How could someone walk into a barn and vanish without leaving a single new footprint in the deep snow outside? It seemed physically impossible. Frustrated, the lead deputy walked back out and examined the original footprints very carefully. He noticed something bizarre. The prints looked slightly misshapen, as if they had been stepped in more than once. As he backtracked the trail, he realized that all 6 miles of footprints were actually double prints. The only logical conclusion was mind-boggling. After walking 6 miles to the barn, the driver had turned around and walked all 6 miles backwards, perfectly placing their feet inside their own original footprints to avoid creating a new trail. The deputies followed the tracks all the way back to the idling SUV, where the trail simply vanished. That evening, investigators traced the plates to Don Kemp. They contacted his mother, Mary, who confirmed his road trip, but emphasized that Don had absolutely no history of mental illness, took no disorienting medications, and was a highly responsible man. A massive search involving horses and aircraft was launched, but on the 3rd day, a severe blizzard swept through the area, forcing the sheriff's department to call off the search entirely, assuming Don had either frozen to death or disappeared on purpose. The ghostly calls and independent investigation. The case went completely cold until April of 1983, 5 months after Don vanished. In New York City, a woman named Judy Aiello, who had been a close colleague of Don's for 10 years, returned home to find a message on her answering machine. When she pressed play, she was shocked to hear Don's voice. All he said was, "I'd like to speak to you again. Call me," followed by a phone number. Knowing he was missing and presumed dead, Judy immediately called the number back. A man picked up, but it wasn't Don. He sounded incredibly nervous. When Judy asked to speak to Don, the man stammered, "Okay, I'll let you talk to him," before quickly changing his mind, saying, No, he's not here." Judy left her number and hung up, deeply unsettled. At first, she wondered if it was a cruel prank, but it couldn't be. Not only did she know Don's voice perfectly, but Judy's phone number was completely unlisted. The caller had to be someone who knew her personally. She went straight to the police. Authorities traced the call to a trailer home in Casper, Wyoming, just 2 hours away from where Dawn's SUV had been abandoned. The trailer belonged to a man named Mark Dennis. When Captain Mark Benton paid a visit to the trailer, Mark Dennis claimed he knew nothing about any call to New York and had never even heard the name Dawn Kemp. Suspicious of his story, Captain Benton asked him to take a polygraph test. Dennis agreed initially, but within days, a lawyer contacted the police stating Dennis would no longer cooperate. Because he wasn't an official suspect and the police lacked concrete evidence, they dropped the investigation into him. When Mary Kemp heard this, she was furious at the lack of effort from law enforcement. She decided to fly out to Wyoming to investigate her son's disappearance herself. She marched into the sheriff's office and demanded the case files. Looking through the photos of Dawn's abandoned SUV, Mary noticed disturbing details the police had minimized. The passenger side mirror was broken, the rubber door gasket was ripped off, and the key left in the ignition was bent completely in half. To Mary, it looked like Dawn had been run off the road or abducted, not that he had just walked away. Even worse, she discovered that the investigators had never fingerprinted the car or made plaster casts of the footprints in the snow. All forensic evidence was permanently gone. Mary spent weeks in Wyoming trying to find answers. She called Mark Dennis, who denied everything and hung up on her. She visited local museums and put up reward posters. Finally, she got one credible lead. 2 people in Casper reported seeing a man matching Dawn's description in April 1983, around the time of the eerie phone calls. One was a bartender, and the other saw him at a traveling exhibit about Abraham Lincoln. Given Dawn's research topic, the sighting seemed highly credible. However, because a month had passed since those sightings, the trail went cold again, and a defeated Mary returned to Maryland. The grim discovery. On October 4, 1985, nearly 3 years after Dawn disappeared, a group of hunters was hiking through the woods in Carbon County, Wyoming, when they spotted what looked like white rocks in the grass. As they got closer, they realized they were looking at a fully intact human skeleton still wearing clothes. When authorities arrived, they found a wallet in the pants pocket containing a driver's license for Dawn Kemp. An autopsy revealed that Dawn had died of exposure to the elements, with no signs of foul play. The sheriff's department officially concluded that Dawn had suffered a sudden mental breakdown, walked into the wilderness voluntarily, and died during the blizzard 3 days after abandoning his car. While it sounds like a neat conclusion, it only raises terrifying questions. Dawn's body was found just 4 miles from his SUV, an area that teams had meticulously searched for days with planes and horses. The terrain was entirely flat and bare. How could everyone have missed his body if he had been there the whole time? If Dawn had truly died in the blizzard just 3 days after vanishing in 1982, who made those phone calls to Judy in April 1983 using his exact voice and leaving a number traced to Mark Dennis's trailer? And who was the man researching Lincoln in Casper 5 months after Dawn disappeared? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more mysteries that defy explanation on Beyond the Case. Until next time.